Hello and welcome back to The Olden Shot. Today I thought I'd make a video to help people who are thinking about moving into film photography. It might be especially helpful to people who grew up after the end of the film era and I'm going to give some recommendations not on specific cameras but maybe types of cameras based on what previous experience you might have of photography or even film photography. Ziggy's back again, thinking I'm weird talking to a camera. He doesn't know what's going on. But, the first thing we'll start with is the compact camera, 35mm. Incidentally, all the cameras are 35mm. I believe people coming into film photography, just starting out, 35mm would be my recommendation. Medium format and larger formats I think would be better if you decide to go in that direction or be more serious about your film photography. So I've got two examples of compact cameras, 35mm film cameras, and they have short zooms. This one, Konica, goes from 35 to 70mm zoom. The Olympus goes from 38 to 80. These cameras are designed so that when you pick up a camera, you press the button, you're going to get a well exposed photograph every time. They're autofocus, auto exposure and auto flash. In fact, when you turn them on, they're already set to auto flash, so even if you're indoors, you pick it up, take a photograph, the flash will go off and you'll have a well exposed photograph. So really all you need to think about is your composition. And focusing, there's one thing you need to think about is that when you're composing your photograph, you half press on the button, it'll focus before you full press and take the shot. If you're too quick on the button, you're not giving the autofocus the chance to be correct. Both these cameras and others like them take excellent photographs. They're going to be well exposed. If they're in focus, they're going to be wonderfully sharp, and the only limiting factor really is that you can't vary many things to take more artistic control of your shots. The art comes from the composition, which is all down to your eye. As the name suggests, they're wonderfully compact. You can fit them in your pocket and they're unobtrusive when you're taking photographs. And I think they're a great camera to start with, because if you're taking, say, a 36 exposure film and you get 36 properly exposed photographs, it's going to encourage you to carry on. This is Olympus, this is Konica, all the major camera manufacturers did compact cameras, including Pentax, Canon, Minolta, Nikon, they all did them. My only recommendation is, if you're trying to pick one up, go for a known camera brand, like some of the ones I've mentioned. A camera like this you'll get for next to nothing, because it's not the most attractive camera in the world. These ones, the Olympus Mu series, go for quite a lot of money these days. Anything for a fully working camera tested anything from 50 to 400 pounds, I would say. They're very popular, they look good, and they fit in your pocket. The lenses are good. The lenses are good on these as well. So that's the 35mm compact cameras. Next, these are autofocus SLR cameras. Come from the end of the film camera era, and again, they're designed so that if you press the button, you're going to get a well exposed photograph every time, and with the autofocus it should also be in focus, so nice sharp photographs every time. That would be the aim for people using these cameras. They normally come, when you bought them new, they normally come with a short zoom, and that's what I've got on these cameras. This one's actually 35 to 70mm zoom, and this one is actually 35 to 80mm zoom. This is a Minolta Dynax 4, one of the last of the film cameras from Minolta. Came from around about 2002. The Canon is an EOS 3000N. It's a 90s camera, I believe. They both have just about every function you could hope for. They've got, apart from autofocus, they've got auto exposure, and that can be with aperture priority, where you set the aperture and the camera chooses the shutter speed, or there can be shutter priority, where you choose the shutter and the camera chooses the aperture. They've also got program mode, which is like a fully automatic exposure, where it chooses both the diaphragm, the aperture and the shutter speed for you. And on top of that they have scene modes, which is like a pre-programmed exposure function for various situations, like portrait, landscape, close-up, night portrait and sports mode. These, I think, are a step up from the compact cameras. They're heavier, they're certainly not unobtrusive, but they allow you to take more control of the artistic aspects of photography, and also you can change lenses on them. So you can pick up various, quite a good collection of different lenses as you develop in your photography. But I think it's good to start with what I would call a standard zoom, where it's a short zoom going from somewhere like 35 to 70, 35 to 80, because it's like slightly wide angle to slightly telephoto, and it will cover most situations. These cameras, especially autofocus cameras, autofocus SLRs, are again reasonably priced. I recently sold a Canon like this one for, I think it was £25 with a lens on, and you can look on eBay and you'll find them in that sort of price range, depending on the lens on them and also the desirability. But I would say anything from £20 up to £80 will get you a decent autofocus SLR camera from one of the renowned camera manufacturers, including Minolta, Canon, there's Nikon, there's Pentax, and again I would recommend you go for one of the traditional camera brands, Other companies got involved in photography and became good at it within the digital age, in particular Sony, but I think when it's film cameras, stick to the traditional camera company names. So the compacts I've shown you and the autofocus SLRs I've shown you, I would say if you're new to photography, especially film photography, they're good starting places. They'll get you used to shooting film, learning the discipline of being careful about what you're shooting, because every time you press a button there is a cost with film photography. Films mainly come in two sizes, 24 exposure or 36 exposure, so you've got a finite amount of photographs per roll before you develop or get them developed. If you have a bit more knowledge of photography, or you want to go in at the deep end, let's look at the next ones. These cameras are manual focus cameras, SLR cameras, from late 70s and early 80s I think. We got, at the time it was a lower cost alternative to Pentax or Olympus or those type of brands with Ricoh. Ricoh are a traditional camera manufacturer. They've been around for a long time and produce great cameras. Both these cameras, manual focus, so you've got control of what's in focus yourself. They have auto exposure, and on these cameras they are aperture priority auto exposure, so you set the aperture and the camera sets the shutter speed. Other manufacturers like Canon produce cameras with shutter priority rather than aperture priority, and shutter priority can be important to, say, sports photographers, because freezing the action is more important than having, say, a large depth of field for focusing. Aperture priority is more widespread than shutter priority on automatic cameras. These cameras tended to come with a 50mm lens as standard, and I have to say that cameras of this era, the 50mm lenses tended to be excellent. On the Ricoh, we've got a Rikonon 50mm f2, so the widest aperture is f2. On the Minolta, it's a Minolta 50mm 1.7, f1.7. So this one will let in slightly more light than that one wide open, and will give you a narrower depth of field wide open than that one, but there's not a lot of difference between f1.7 and f2. There's a lot of people fantasize over numbers in photography. A good example of that was the megapixel race, which we had at the start of digital, where my first digital camera was 3 megapixels, and then somebody brought out a 5 megapixel, then somebody brought out an 8 megapixel, and just kept on going. And to be honest, if you're not printing bigger than A4, anything over 5 megapixels isn't necessary, because you won't see any difference. But the apertures and shutter speeds were the things that people used for comparison back in these days. These cameras are heavier than the autofocus cameras. There's a high percentage of metal in them. but again that suggests better quality, better longevity. Both cameras also have manual exposure, so you can switch it off automatic and go to manual, should you prefer. I understand exposure, the exposure triangle, but to be honest, most of the time I use my cameras on automatic because they're very good. Again, interchangeable lenses on these, if we can find the button. You can get a wide variety of lenses for cameras produced by the main manufacturers. The Ricoh uses a K-mount, which was a bayonet mount developed by Pentax. There are a few manufacturers use the K-mount, and there's a lot of lenses for various manufacturers will fit that camera. The Minolta in the 60s they brought out a lot of cameras where the model began with the SR, and that was the SR bayonet was developed to become the MC bayonet and then the MD bayonet, which is this one, but they're all interchangeable. The only difference is functionality because of contacts from the lenses to the camera body for automatic functions. So when these cameras came out with auto exposure and manual, there was cameras from other manufacturers, quite famous ones like the Pentax ME Super was around at the same time. The Olympus OM10 came out at this time. The Olympus OM10 was automatic only unless you bought a manual adapter which plugged into the front of the camera and then give you also manual exposure. But I had an Olympus OM10 for years and just used it on automatic and got some great photographs out of it. The other manufacturers like Nikon, like Canon also made cameras which were auto exposure, aperture priority or auto exposure shutter priority, and also had manual. These cameras tend to go for slightly higher prices than the autofocus cameras. I think these tend to be bought by more serious hobby photographers, and there can be competition on eBay auctions for them. The next set of cameras are the ones that have built-in light meters but are not automatic cameras. You meter through the lens on them, but then it tells you what to set it on, or with the Praktica more or less it tells you if you've got it on the right aperture or the right shutter speed, but it doesn't tell you what that has to be. You just have to look through the viewfinder, see the exposure marks and adjust until you've got the right, in this case it's two arrows pointing towards each other. That tells you you've got the right exposure. Quite heavy cameras. These were used by a lot of beginners in late 60s, early 70s, because they were cheaper than the Japanese equivalent, but they were also a little bit more expensive than the Russian Zenits because they had a bit more to them, like faster shutter speeds and a slightly faster lens. The Fuji camera, STX2, same thing. You meter it through the viewfinder. It's got a little arrow inside, and you adjusting your aperture or shutter speed will dictate where the arrow goes. Once it's in the centre spot, that tells you you've got the exposure right. And these cameras probably for beginners will bring on your knowledge of exposure quicker than an automatic camera, but the less automation you have in the camera, the more chance you have of duff frames. You will have a failure rate. If you want a good, well exposed photograph every time, you go with the more automated cameras. If you want to take more control and therefore take on more risk of getting a bad photograph, then go with a manual camera with the meter attached. Even before these cameras were other SLR cameras which were fully manual, didn't have light meters, and most of those cameras now are either in the hands of collectors or have been scrapped because they're that old. So of this type, all the major manufacturers produced this type of camera in the 60s and early 70s. So you had metering, but you had to set the exposure yourself. Great cameras, great fun to use, and take a little bit more thought than the automatic ones. The final cameras, or final type of cameras I'm going to cover on this one, are the 35mm compact cameras from the late 50s, early 60s that came with a fixed lens and a leaf shutter. A lot of them were made in Germany. We've got a Zeiss Contina from Germany, and we've got a Kodak Retinet, which was also made in Germany. They're very well made. They're quite heavy for the size because they're all metal, and there's a lot of these still about because we're fully mechanical. There's no batteries, there's no electronics, it's all mechanical. The shutters would have worked off clockwork. There's a bit of a jump in the film there because the camera decided that that video was long enough and switched itself off. But I think we just mentioned that there are clockwork shutters on these cameras. The lenses on these compact cameras from this time tended to be somewhere between 40 and 45mm focal length fixed lenses, and a lot of them had a maximum aperture of 2.8. There were some were a bit slower than that, maybe 3.5, but these two are f2.8 examples. The lenses usually were, the better quality ones were 4-element lenses, Tessar type lens, 4 elements in 3 groups, and there was also what they call triplets, which are 3-element lenses. The 4-element lenses give a bit better quality, especially in the edges and corners, than the triplets, but for the majority of people who were using these tended to be holiday photos, taking groups shots of the friends and family, and edge and corner performance wasn't really important. And also the smaller the aperture, They'd go down to f16 and some of them even went to f22. They give you edge-to-edge sharpness at those sort of apertures. Generally the cameras give very, very good results, but you need to know the exposure theory. You can use Sunny 16s, so if they've got a meter you can use the meter, but normally you would have to read off and then set your camera based on the reading. Or you could use an external light meter, one that you carry round to measure exposure. You can even get an exposure meter on your mobile phone, your smartphone. I tend to use Sunny 16s unless there are difficult light situations, especially on the duller days and in shadowy areas like forests and steep valleys, what have you. All of the cameras that I've shown you today are capable of producing excellent quality photographs. Sharp, well exposed. The more manual they are, or the less automatic they are, the more input that needs to be coming from the operator, the more chance there is of failure, of course. But that's the fun in photography. You take your shots and then you've got the anticipation of waiting to see the results, either through home development or through a lab. You can't take a shot and look at the back of the camera. You just have to wait. It's all part of the fun of film photography. I think that's it for this video. As I said, it was to introduce different camera types so that you would have an idea of where you wanted to enter the world of film photography. I may in a future video talk about techniques for using film in cameras, what to watch out for, the pitfalls and the rewards. We may talk about Sunny 16s, we may talk about zone focusing and hyperfocal distance. There are, if you can't wait, there are videos on YouTube covering those things, but that's my recommendation, not for a specific camera type, but not for a specific model of camera. Most cameras from the eras that we've discussed that came from the traditional camera manufacturers were good and will give good results. Bear in mind when you're buying them, the older the camera, the more chances are there's something to go wrong with them. Where there's moving parts involved, nothing lasts forever, of course. Having said that, we've got cameras here from the 50s and early 60s. The Contina is at least 62 years old. The Retinet probably somewhere between 55 and 60 years old, and they're both working. The Contina, some of the slow shutter speeds are off now, but for normal daylight photography, handheld, the shutter speeds from a 30th up to the maximum speed, which is a 300th, are working fine. The Kodak's working fine throughout its shutter speed range. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please ask in the comments. I'll be happy to share any knowledge that I may have, and I respond quickly usually. That's it for now. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.